Hello, everyone, and welcome to our new topic for biology, Unit 5. Our topic will be about mitosis. Mitosis is the division of the nucleus that happens as part of the cell cycle of cells that are dividing. And so all cells have their normal part of their cycle, and they have their nuclear division, and then they have the part of their cycle where they're splitting into two new cells so that you can make the tissues bigger and the organs bigger and replace the cells that are dying off in your body. So by the end of this video, we're going to be able to identify the different types of phases of a cell cycle that you see here in this microscope image. So let's get started. We're going to start by watching a time-lapse video of mitosis happening. It takes about 2.5 hours or so for this whole process to finish, and I'll narrate it for you as it goes. You can see that on the outside of the cell, there's a cell membrane here. You can see those chromosomes thickening and forming into what we consider the chromosome shape as kind of like an X, and they're all stacked on top of each other. And so they start to move towards the middle of the cell and line up along the equator. You can see all of them are going to line up along the center of that cell. And then almost instantly, because this is time-lapse, those chromatids, or half of chromosomes, are going to pull apart towards opposite sides of the cell. And then you'll see in the middle the cytoplasm splitting. We're going to take a closer look and a deeper dive into that process of how one cell makes a copy so that it has another copy to make your body build and repair and more healthy and to grow. So again, these are the types of cells that you'll see when we do the microscope lab. And so you've got different phases here shown and labeled, and we've got some arrows showing chromosomes and nuclear membranes, and we're going to learn to identify those for this particular unit. Some more cells, and let's go on to the cell cycle itself. So go ahead and take notes as you go along. Stop if you need more stops than the Edpuzzle allows for you. Here's our general model for the structure of the DNA molecule. If you'll remember, it's a double helix. It's a special name that we use to describe the shape of the DNA molecule. It's an incredibly long molecule, microscopically, right? And it's so coiled and twisted up on itself that it can fit within the nucleus of your cell, which again, as you remember, is very small. This DNA not only fits inside your cell, but it fits inside each of the nuclei inside the cell of your bodies. And again, as we talked about, I mentioned earlier, the DNA coils around specific proteins called histones. And it coils and coils very tightly, as you saw in that beginning video. And that makes it thicker and thicker during that mitosis process. And so it coils to achieve the fit inside your nucleus and will get thicker during mitosis. Here is a model that helps us understand how that coiling occurs. So you can see at the bottom of the model, that golden double helix part of the illustration, where it's just showing the very detailed structure of DNA. And then it starts to coil around these circular structures called histones. And when the DNA coils around the histones, it's called a nucleosome. And it continues to coil and folds back and forth on itself until it becomes this recognizable shape that we call a chromosome. And those chromosomes really are only visible to us during the end of prophase and in metaphase, and then they start to divide in anaphase. And we'll learn those phases and what's going on in each phase in our notes today. This is a model showing the parts of the cell cycle, and we're going to learn the parts of each of these separately. You can see that interphase is here, and that cell spends most of its life in interphase. So if we start about here at that G1 phase, sometimes they call that G1 phase the growth 1 phase, and sometimes I've heard it called the gap 1 phase as it is illustrated here. And we'll talk about what happens in each of these portions of the cell cycle as we go along. And then we've got the S phase, or the DNA synthesis phase, followed by gap 2 or growth 2 phase, and mitosis, where the actual nuclear division occurs. And then this tiny little portion here represented by this black line, which is the cytokinesis part, where if you remember back to the animation at the beginning, was when the cytoplasm split and it actually became 2 separate cells, each having 2 nuclei formed during that mitosis phase. Let's take a look at each of these phases individually. Each of these will have an explanation, and it'll have a little drawing on it to help you understand what all the parts are. So in interphase, which is the largest portion of the cell cycle, as you can see here, it lasts from gap 1 all the way around into gap 2. Some cells never actually make it out of that growth phase, particularly like your neurons and your brain cells, which we understand to not be replaced. And they spend that time just in that general growth phase. But for those cells that are going to reproduce, like your skin cells and your stomach cells and your hair cells and your blood cells that are formed in your bone marrow, those cells will go into the DNA synthesis phase, which makes a copy of the DNA, and then they'll continue with more growth before they go into mitosis. So let's find out what happens in this really long phase, interphase. As I mentioned before, that gap 1 phase is sometimes called that growth phase because there's a lot of things that are growing and in the cell. The cell is doing its everyday regular activities. There are enzymes being produced, enzymes like lactase and sucrase and catalase that break down some of the chemicals in our body that we need broken down even smaller than they already are. And then we also have enzymes that build up, things like build up our muscle when we're growing bigger, or build up our bones when our bones need repair. As studied in Unit 2, also organelles are produced, like ribosomes and mitochondria, the SER and the Golgi and the lysosomes and those vacuoles. All of those organelles are produced during this growth phase. And this is just normal cell production and growth and helping you stay alive. So this is that general phase of the cell. The synthesis phase, or the S phase of interphase, is where DNA is replicated. And again, the only reason why they would need DNA replicated is so that it could be used again in the next cell that is produced by this process. Again, we'll need each new cell to have a copy of the instructions that make you or make the organism that it's occurring in. So every cell has those instructions of how to build a whole new you. The third phase of interphase is the G2 phase. Again, sometimes it's called gap 2 or the growth phase 2. And in this phase, the cell is making more of what it needs to supply the new cell so that both cells, the original and the copy, will have all the organelles that are needed for the new cell to be functional. So it needs more mitochondria, it needs more ribosomes, those types of things. It'll start producing those organelles for the new cell. Let's